Hello again, YouTube. Lovell Hawes, prior enlisted Marine history buff, and just somebody who generally does a lot of research. Today, with a history lesson, I will be telling the story of Old 666. Well, that was a B-17 with the tail numbers being 666 on the tail of it, and nobody wanted to fly it at one point because of the fact that every time it went out, it got shot to pieces. Go figure. If you believe in the numerology behind 666, it stands to be the devil's plane, basically. Well, one crew really didn't have much of a choice because of disciplinary issues. They were put at the bottom of the line for a new plane, so they were basically never going to get one. So they looked through and they found old 666 and they fixed it up. And they made some modifications to it where it was almost bristling with twice as many defensive guns as your typical B 17, including a gun that the pilot himself could actually take one hand off the controls and actually fire the weapon. And it also had double machine guns in several positions, including in the waist guns and on the navigator's position. And that was because they were going to do the dumb missions, the missions nobody wanted to come or wanted to do because they were suicide missions. And one of those missions that they did this, it was basically a reconnaissance mission uh, where there was going to actually be an amphibious landing on the island the next day, and they needed the reconnaissance data that bomber was going to collect. And it was in the Pacific. The Japanese picked up the bomber on there, detected the bomber, decided to launch fighters to actually knock this bomber down because, well, the reconnaissance data would actually would actually cause a lot more Japanese to die. A very respectable reason to go knock this bomber down. Where they sent up 12 Zeke fighters, and unbeknownst to even the Japanese, that there was a returning light, more like a heavy fighter, really, that was in itself on a scouting run. And all 666 had the opportunity to turn tail and run because they knew the fighters were coming. But I knew it would take some time to get up to their altitude to actually be a threat to them. But because of the fact that the pilot himself had actually been in the infantry before, he knew the importance of the reconnaissance data. So he decided to push forth and decide to complete the mission anyway. They completed the mission, and on their return, the 12 fighters actually surrounded the plane outside of the range of its guns, and what they were doing was coordinating the attack. And that's when they began to try to methodically tear that B 17 apart. In which case, there was some cases of where the B 17 actually scored a few kills. They managed to get a few of the fighters, but the Flying Fortress sustained very, very heavy damage. The pilot himself even got a kill and even managed to kill the Japanese heavy fighter that was on its own reconnaissance run because it was going to make a run straight at the cockpit, which normally a B 17 would be completely defenseless against, but because of all 666's modification, with the machine gun being where the pilot could have a little bit of firepower of his own, they actually managed to light it up enough that it made evasive maneuvers, and then the twin 50 calibers that the navigator had available to it, to his position, actually finished the job. So they did actually manage to knock some of the Japanese planes out of the sky, and several of the crew was hit, even killed. The pilot himself was actually very, very heavily critically wounded to the point of where, when the plane finally made it back to base, that they thought the pilot was dead, except for he was still alive. He wanted to tell them to go, well, I'll leave that one to your imagination. He was too weak to even do that, and I don't know how they managed to figure out he was still alive. But he was still alive on that one. The tail gunner had been killed, and a lot of the bomber itself was torn all to pieces. But despite being outnumbered 13 to 1, This particular bomber still managed to make it back. The siege on the flying fortress had to be lifted because the fighters had to turn around and head back because frankly they were just out of ammunition. They just couldn't go after it anymore. And yeah, there was uh, tons and tons of damage done throughout the plane. It was one of those cases where you could start counting on one wing, and before you even got to one of the engines, you'd have to stop counting because you just got tired of it. And yeah, it was one of those cases of where you can actually look into an episode of the History Channel series called Dogfights, which typically covers fighter on fighter combat, but in this particular case, it shows a lot of long odds where planes that normally aren't built for fighter combat or were taking on fighters and were actually taking them on where there was more than one. In this particular case, Hold 666 was doing what was called 13v1 the hard way, where there were 13 of them, one of you. And no pilot wants to take on those kind of odds because there's not very many pilots that can come out of it in one piece. But somehow, this one guy, he managed to survive to tell the tale of what had happened here. They did complete their mission. All of the men of 666 were promptly decorated for this. All 10 of them. Because of actually completing their mission. And how dangerous it was. Like I said, it was a suicide mission. And I mean, normally one bomber versus 12 fighters, that one bomber is going to be shot to pieces, and the crew is going to end up bailing out what's left of the crew. And it's like, in all honesty, it's like these guys. It's hard to imagine it, but any of you who actually know what a B-17 looks like, it's a four-engine heavy bomber. It's not known for maneuverability. It's known for being able to take a beating and keep on ticking. It's also known to have a lot of defensive guns. One up top, that's the top turret. One below, the ball turret. One in the back, that's the tail gunner. One on each side of one position, one on each side of the fuselage. Those are the waist gunners. The radio operator, he has a gun that fires out the dorsal of the aircraft, basically right down the middle of the fuselage. The navigator and the bombardier each have a gun, and the pilots, well, they can probably spit on them. But there was a lot of firepower on a typical V-17, and this one had a heck of a lot more. And Hold 666 was still facing those kind of odds where it has been known that only 2 or 3 fighters has been known to take down a B-17 at a time. The Germans had quite a feast on our B-17s, where in some cases where we'd send out 100 of them and 30 of them wouldn't come back because of the fact that they were hit by anti-aircraft fire, they were hit by fighters. It was just awful. We had to have special fighter escorts in order to make sure those bombers could get through. So these guys taking on those kind of odds and living to tell the tale about it all, but as far as I can tell, the tail gunner lived to tell the tale. It actually says a lot about how hard they fought. And the Flying Fortress definitely lived up to his name. It took quite the pounding. And even then, I'm sure those guys wouldn't want to do that mission again. Yeah, it's like, no. Knowing what kind of pain they went through to make that happen, they didn't want to do that again. And honestly, I don't blame them. But I'm going to be going on a bit of a vacation over the course of this weekend to Williamsburg. And it was something that we had planned when I was still working and before my mother ended up sick in the first place. So turned out it was a reservation that we couldn't cancel, so we're just going to do it. And I think it'll be good for me to have that little bit of distraction. But I'm thinking about maybe making a series of videos if we can get into the Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach, making a few videos about the planes that we see there, especially the ones on the flight line, because we'll get a good look at those. And if I'm not able to get there, I'll just update you guys, and that'll be my history lesson videos for a while because they've got some pretty good ones there. I happen to last time I was there on the flight line, we saw a Focke-Wulf 190, an ME 109, a Hawker Hurricane, and a Supermarine Spitfire all on flight line together. I mean, that was great. That was really awesome. And all the planes the Military Aviation Museum actually fly. And they have the World War One hangar and the World War Two hangar. In the World War One hangar, I saw the Albatross, the very plane that made Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, famous. And I also saw a Sopwith Camel, the plane that was credited with killing the Red Baron. And I was like, man, knowing those planes fly, if it wasn't for these here glasses, my friends, I would have done anything I could have to end up in the cockpit of an F-18 myself. I would have loved to fly. It's like I know about the stories of men like Oswald Belke and Manfred von Richthofen and his brother Lothar. Oh, Lothar was a piece of work. His brother didn't have much kind to say about him. It's like that gives you a little idea. And also, at the same time, I know of Eddie Rickenbacker, our first ace of aces. I know about Guinemer, a French ace. Oh man. I can't wait to get into that aviation museum again because there happens to be my favorite World War II fighter of all, the F-4U Corsair. And I might save that for the next history lesson. Do a two-parter on that one, where one is actually going to be about the leader of the Black Sheep Squadron, Greg Boyington, aka Pappy, because he was a bit of an old man at the time. And I might actually follow it up with his squadron. And I was like, that one I might have to do a little bit more research on because I know more about Boyington than I do about the Black Sheep. But the Black Sheep still exist. They're flying AV-8Bs right now. And I was like, if I couldn't have gotten into an F-18, I would have happily flown a Harrier, the AV-8B Harrier. So when it comes to talking about our flying aces, I do love talking about them. And it's actually a little something that gets my personal motor going because it is just awesome to see a fighter plane. Some of them, absolutely beautiful planes. And I was like, the Corsair, please do look up the Corsair. I maintain it was the most beautiful fighter of the Second World War. Absolutely gorgeous, elegant, but she was also fast and deadly. Those 650 calibers was quite the punch. And it was Marines like Boynton that made it deadly. They were not, they were very happy to show the Japanese just how dangerous they could be at the controls of them. Yeah, but yeah, unfortunately for old 666, squadrons like the F4U squadrons that was with the Black Sheep or any of the other fighter squadrons were unavailable to give old 666 an escort. It might have helped if they'd been able to get, like, say, 4 fighters, because at least then they would have been able to keep some of the Japanese off of old 666's back. And I am willing to bet after that particular mission that even the Japanese were wondering if that particular bomber was possessed, because I'm willing to bet they fought like they were in Hades. So that is y'all's history lesson for today. Please let me know if there's any particular story that you want me to cover. I do like to try and cover some of the smaller ones because it's easier to follow up. It's easier to picture some of the circumstances that some of these men were in when it comes to talking about smaller scale. And I mean, even then, last time it was Bruno Guido, and it's pretty hard to imagine you're on an aircraft carrier flight deck and you run across the flight deck to your plane to shoot down an enemy aircraft that's incoming, just to have your plane have its tail sheared off while you're still in it. Yeah, Bruno Guido, people. Yeah, it's like, but it's easier to imagine that than some of the things that are larger scale battles. It's like it's a little harder to actually know the names of some of the people, and it's like I prefer. It's like I've actually been considering when my ability to type has returned of actually writing a book about the Stonewall Brigade. In which case, they actually got their nickname in the Battle of Manassas when they were commanded by Stonewall Jackson. They both got their nickname at the same time. But at the same time, the Stonewall Brigade has also been known to participate in certain battles throughout history where they were among the units that landed on Omaha Beach. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, the intensity of that particular firefight. Anybody you see wearing a yin yang that actually has a blue and the gray on their uniforms, that is part of the 29th Infantry, and there's a good chance that some of those men were Stonewall Brigade that you saw in that movie. Or at least they were reenacting Stonewall Brigade, because that's exactly what the Stonewall Brigade did in 1944. They were storming the beaches at Omaha on June 6, 1944. At that point, they'd already become known as the 116th Infantry Regiment. In fact, the 116th Infantry Regiment still exists. The closest of their armories is only about 6 miles away from my position. So, like, I know exactly where they are. And they are still called the Stonewall Brigade. So, I'm actually kind of curious as to what the Stonewall Brigade has done in its entire history, from the time they were first formed as the 1st Virginia Brigade all the way up to today. And eventually, I would actually have to culminate that research by actually presenting what I've actually brought to the brigade commander and actually show him what I've done so far, and then go, okay, in order to finish this book, I need to know what you guys have done since this. And it's going to be a little more difficult in some places. After all, we don't know what they did during the Korean War. We don't know what they did during Vietnam. I know they missed out on Grenada. That's the Stonewall Brigade, and I don't want to get too much bigger than that because it's hard to imagine even a brigade, which is these days is roughly about 1,800 men. And I was like, no, that's difficult enough to imagine. And it's hard enough to imagine. It's even harder to imagine a division. These days, about 25,000 men. And it's really, really difficult to picture all of that. I want to try and keep it a little smaller, talk about certain individuals where I can. If I cannot, then I'll try and make it small groups. Try and keep it no bigger than, say, a platoon or a company. And it's like kind of like they did with Band of Brothers, where they covered Easy Company of the 101st Airborne. And it's like, no. Yeah, I don't want to go too much bigger than that. But I've been level. You guys have been great. I know that you guys have a lot of things that you need to do throughout your day. So I appreciate all of you taking about 20 minutes of your time to come watch me yap for a little bit. And I'll be seeing you guys again later.